At the divorce negotiation table, my husband was making absurd demands. He wanted our $1.5 million suburban Chicago home, our entire life savings, and the lucrative investment portfolio in his name. His plan was to leave me with absolutely nothing, except for sole custody of our 7-year-old twins. My lawyer pleaded with me to fight back. She warned me that agreeing to these ridiculous terms would be the biggest financial mistake of my life. Meanwhile, sitting across the long conference table, my soon-to-be ex-husband smirked with arrogant triumph. He was absolutely convinced he had just dismantled my future. But he had no idea that my signature on those legal documents was actually the final piece of a trap I had spent months setting. My name is Gwendolyn. I am 33 years old. My profession? I track digital financial crimes for a living. Bradley tossed his heavy, custom gold pen across the polished mahogany table, his voice dripping with the condescension only a pretentious 35-year-old wealth management executive could muster. He leaned back in his expensive leather chair and casually adjusted his designer cuffs, telling me to sign the papers so I could leave with my kids. The thick divorce settlement sat between us, a stack of legal documents designed to systematically erase my entire financial existence. According to the agreement, Bradley would keep the massive estate we bought together in the Chicago suburbs. He would take all the funds from our joint savings. Most importantly, he demanded 100% sole ownership of his investment portfolio. From the gallery seats behind us, a loud, deliberate whisper echoed through the quiet courtroom. My 62-year-old former mother-in-law, Patricia, scoffed that they were finally getting rid of the dead weight. She sat in the second row, wearing a tailored designer blazer and clutching an incredibly expensive handbag, making sure her voice carried all the way to the judge. Patricia had always viewed my middle-class background as a disease her son had unfortunately caught. For years, she told anyone who would listen that my career in cybersecurity was nothing more than a glorified receptionist job. She loved bragging about Bradley's financial genius while dismissing my work as boring typing on a computer. My lawyer, Rebecca, was sharp and deeply protective. Before I could reach for the pen, she slammed her hand down on the contract. She leaned in close, whispering frantically that I could not do this. She pointed out that I was giving up everything I had worked for. I had worked 80 hours a week, writing complex code to pay for his master's degree, and paid the mortgage on our house alone for 3 years so he could launch his firm. She begged me not to let him clean me out and leave me with nothing for Leo and Mia. I looked at Rebecca, then slowly turned my gaze to Bradley. He was watching me with a smug, victorious grin. He thrived on this power imbalance, completely believing that my silence meant total surrender. For 7 years, I had quietly managed our home, raised our twins, and endured endless insults about my career and intelligence from his family. They honestly thought my daily job consisted of resetting passwords for office clerks. They had no idea about my actual work. I was a senior federal consultant, tracking illicit financial networks for the Department of Defense and government contractors. I gently pushed Rebecca's hand off the document. I told her I was not going to fight him. I picked up the gold pen, feeling its weight in my hand, and told them he could have exactly what he asked for. Bradley let out a soft laugh, turning to give his mother a knowing look of victory. He mocked me as I signed, telling me it was good I finally understood my place. He sneered that while the tech industry might pay my modest salary, I did not have the grit to survive in real finance. He told me to take the kids to my crowded new apartment and leave the heavy lifting to the adults, claiming I was never built for high-stakes games. I did not flinch, yell, or react to his bait. I simply pressed the pen to the paper and signed my name with smooth, decisive strokes. I turned the page and signed again. I initialed every single paragraph that granted him sole legal ownership, and more importantly, sole legal liability of his entire investment fund. With the final signature complete, I slid the documents back across the table to his eager attorney. George. The judge, a serious man who had remained quiet during our tense exchange, gathered the paperwork. He verified the signatures, stamped the final decree, and brought his gavel down with a sharp strike. He declared the marriage officially dissolved, with assets divided exactly as outlined in the signed agreement. Patricia let out a loud sigh of relief from the gallery. George. Bradley stood up quickly, buttoning his suit jacket with the posture of a man who believed he had just pulled off the perfect heist. He snapped his briefcase shut and looked down at me, telling me I should have hired a better lawyer because I was leaving with nothing. He wished me luck starting from scratch. Right at that exact second, the phone in my coat pocket buzzed. George. I pulled it out and glanced at the lock screen. An encrypted alert from my secure server flashed brightly against the dark background. It confirmed that legal ownership had transferred, security protocols were deactivated, and the target was isolated. A slow, genuine smile spread across my face. I stood up, smoothed down my skirt, and felt a sudden wave of absolute clarity. George. I had not lost a single thing today. I had simply handed him a ticking clock, and he had eagerly signed his name to it. I grabbed my bag and looked Bradley straight in the eye. The smugness on his face wavered for a fraction of a second, clearly unsettled by my complete lack of despair. I told him to enjoy the portfolio, letting him know it was entirely his now, down to the last penny. George. I turned and walked down the center aisle, my heels clicking sharply against the marble floor. I did not look back at Patricia's shocked face or my ex-husband. I walked straight out into the morning light, knowing the real game was just beginning. By afternoon, the harsh sun beat down on the driveway of our suburban estate. George. I packed the very last cardboard box into the trunk of my 10-year-old sedan. Leo and Mia were already buckled into the back seat, quietly playing on their tablets. They were too young to fully understand why we were leaving the only home they had ever known, but they could easily sense the heavy tension in the air. George. Standing at the top of the marble steps were Patricia and Monica, watching me leave like prison guards supervising an eviction. My former mother-in-law held a glass of sparkling water, her sharp eyes scanning my cheap car with obvious disgust. George. She took a slow sip and raised her voice, making sure the wealthy neighbors could hear, instructing Monica to keep a close eye on the boxes, so I did not take any fine china or silverware. Monica leaned against the massive oak door and laughed, telling her mother that with my low salary, I could never afford to replace them anyway. George. She scoffed at my car, saying the suspension would collapse if I tried to steal anything heavy, and remarked that Bradley was already having the locks changed. I completely ignored them and focused on locking my trunk. For 7 years, I had listened to these women belittle my background, mock my clothes, and dismiss my career. George. They honestly believed I was just a technician who fixed keyboards, completely unaware of the highly advanced digital architecture I built for the government. Let them think I was broke and desperate, it only made my next move easier. Suddenly, the loud roar of a high-performance engine broke the quiet suburban street. George. A brand-new, custom black Porsche Panamera pulled into the driveway, its tires crunching on the gravel. The driver's door opened and DeAndre stepped out. As Monica's husband, DeAndre adjusted his designer sunglasses with a smug, arrogant grin. He looked exactly like a stereotypical Silicon Valley tech founder, entirely oblivious to the fraudulent nature of his own existence. George. DeAndre walked over, leaning casually against the hood of his sports car. He looked down at my packed sedan, shook his head with fake sympathy, and told me it was a tough moving day. He crossed his arms over his expensive cashmere sweater and told me I should have never crossed Bradley. George. He condescendingly offered me a loan if I struggled to pay rent next month, bragging that his startup had just secured $10 million in Series A funding that morning. Patricia clapped enthusiastically from the porch, praising DeAndre as a genius and saying Bradley was right to introduce him to those venture capitalists. With a loud thud, I slammed my car trunk shut. Porch. The sharp, heavy metallic sound echoed across the driveway, instantly cutting off Patricia's cheering. I turned around and slowly walked up to DeAndre. I stopped just inches from his smug face, letting my gaze drift down to his expensive shoes before looking him dead in the eye. Porch. I remarked that a $10 million valuation was a very interesting number, especially since that massive valuation was based entirely on a proprietary cybersecurity algorithm he had copied directly from my home desktop. DeAndre froze. The confident smile on his face faltered. He claimed he had no idea what I was talking about and accused me of being bitter over the divorce. Porch. I took a step closer and lowered my voice, ensuring only he could hear me. I told him to stop playing dumb. I reminded him that he had copied that source code from my private hard drive while I was lying in a hospital bed, fighting a severe infection after a difficult delivery with the twins. Porch. While I was hooked up to monitors, he was sitting comfortably in my home office, downloading my life's work onto a flash drive. He had taken the foundation of my career and repackaged it as his own genius invention to sell to Bradley's wealthy friends. DeAndre swallowed hard, glancing nervously back at his wife and mother-in-law on the porch. They were watching us closely, unable to hear our whispers but sensing the sudden shift in energy. He tried to scoff, claiming his company, Ashield Tech, was built from scratch and that he wrote every line of code. He threatened to ruin my career and tie me up in lawsuits if I ever repeated that claim. I smiled gently, pulling my car keys from my pocket. Porch. I told him I had no intention of suing him, asking why I would bother suing someone who only possessed a beta prototype. His brow furrowed in confusion. I jiggled the keys and turned my back to him, pointing out that he had copied an unfinished framework. I told him to enjoy his beta test, and hoped his new investors were not expecting regular security updates. Porch. He yelled after me, his voice cracking with sudden panic, telling me I was crazy and wishing me luck living in poverty. I opened my car door, slid into the driver's seat, and started the engine. Through the open window, I saw DeAndre frantically pulling his phone from his pocket. The screen was flashing wildly. Porch. He answered it, pressing it to his ear, his confident posture completely dissolving into absolute panic. The voice of his lead developer screamed through the speaker, loud enough to be heard over my idling engine. The developer panicked that the core system had locked them out. The entire backend was fully encrypted, and they were completely blind. Porch. DeAndre yelled into the phone, demanding they use the master override code to fix it immediately. The developer responded hysterically that the master license had just been revoked by an external server, meaning the system no longer belonged to them, and the IP registry was wiping itself. They had lost the entire platform. DeAndre slowly lowered his phone, his mouth hanging open in complete shock. Porch. He turned to look at me, his eyes wide as the devastating realization hit him. He finally understood what I had done. He was no longer the brilliant tech founder of a $10 million startup. He was just a fraud holding on to an empty shell of a company. I shifted the car into drive, gave a cheerful wave to Patricia and Monica, and smoothly drove down the driveway. Porch. I left DeAndre standing frozen next to his now useless Porsche. Just 1 week later, Bradley decided to throw himself a massive victory party. I parked my worn-out sedan between a shiny red Ferrari and a black stretch limo. Heavy bass vibrated through the walls of the brick mansion I had helped pay for. Bradley called this event his Independence Gala. To me, it looked more like a hostage situation. I had absolutely no desire to step foot inside that house, but Bradley had intentionally locked Leo and Mia's passports and original medical records inside his office safe. He had ignored my emails for days and blocked my lawyer's calls. He knew the twins needed those exact documents to register for their new school on Monday, and he wanted to force me to come crawl back and beg him. I walked past the hired security and stepped through the grand double doors of the estate. The foyer was thick with the smell of expensive cigars and spilled champagne. Porch, a dozen of Bradley's wealth management colleagues stood around the custom marble bar, laughing loudly and raising their glasses to my supposed financial ruin. I kept my posture perfectly straight, ignoring the condescending stares from women dripping in diamonds and men wearing luxury watches. I spotted Bradley almost immediately. Porch. He was holding a crystal glass of expensive scotch in the center of the massive living room, looking like a king receiving guests. When he saw me approaching, a malicious grin spread across his face. He raised his glass high, calling everyone's attention to my arrival. Porch, he announced to the room that I had crawled back, mocking that I could not even last a week in my small apartment, and asked if I was here to beg for a weekly allowance. His colleagues laughed on cue, clinking their glasses. I stopped right in front of him, entirely unmoved by his pathetic public performance. I crossed my arms and looked at him with cold indifference. Porch. I told him calmly that I had no attachment to the house or to him. I demanded the children's medical records and passports, telling him to open the safe. Bradley sneered, taking a slow sip of his scotch, reminding me that I had signed everything away and was standing on his imported hardwood floors. I stepped closer, speaking softly but clearly enough for his closest friends to hear. Porch. I reminded him of the very first piece of furniture we bought for the house, a cheap desk from a discount store, because he was a broke unpaid intern crying about his massive student loans. I pointed out that while I worked 80 hours a week writing security protocols to put food on the table, he was running around pretending to be a big shot. Porch. I told him he did not build this estate, he hijacked it. His smug grin vanished, replaced by dark anger. His friends looked away awkwardly, as the truth of his financial beginnings hit a nerve. Before Bradley could formulate a response, a sharp voice cut through the tension. Patricia pushed through the crowd, clutching a glass of deep red wine. Porch. Monica followed closely behind in a shimmering white silk designer gown, which she had undoubtedly purchased on a high-interest credit card. Patricia glared at me with pure resentment, hissing that I had some nerve showing up at a high-end event. She lunged forward, pretending to trip over the expensive Persian rug, throwing her arm out to splash the entire glass of red wine directly at my chest. Porch. I had spent 7 years dealing with this woman's dramatic, predictable antics. I simply took a graceful, calculated step to the left. Patricia stumbled forward, completely off balance as her target vanished. The red wine flew through the air, completely missing my clothes, and splashed heavily across the front of Monica's pristine white silk dress. Porch. Monica let out a deafening shriek, causing the string quartet in the corner to stop playing. She clawed frantically at the massive, spreading red stain, screaming that her $3,000 vintage gown was ruined. Patricia panicked, grabbing napkins to wipe the ruined silk, while the guests backed away in shock. Porch. Bradley immediately turned his attention to his hysterical sister and mother, leaving his guard completely down. I did not waste a single second of the distraction. I slipped away from the crowd, walked down the hallway into Bradley's private study, and quietly shut the heavy oak door. Bradley actually believed a military-grade biometric safe would keep me out. Porch. He had completely forgotten that I was a senior digital forensics consultant who had personally written the security patches for that specific hardware brand. I pulled out my modified smartphone, bypassed his weak local network firewall, and sent a force override command to the lock mechanism. Within 30 seconds, the safe clicked open. Porch. I reached inside, grabbed the thick manila envelope containing the kids' essential documents, and tucked it under my arm. I walked casually back to the main reception area, as if I had just taken a quiet stroll. Monica was still crying on a velvet sofa, while Patricia yelled at the valet staff for club soda. Porch. Bradley stood near the bar, rubbing his temples in frustration as his perfect party devolved into a circus. I approached him from behind and dropped a heavy federal envelope onto the marble bar right next to his forgotten scotch. He jumped, turning to glare at me, asking what it was. I smiled sharply, telling him to consider it a belated housewarming gift. Porch. I turned and walked toward the front door, leaving the loud music and his sister's screams behind. Before I even reached the driveway, I heard the sound of paper being torn open, followed by a sudden, absolute silence in the room. As Bradley looked down at the documents, the color drained from his face. The official seal of the United States government stared back at him. Porch. It was a direct, non-negotiable federal subpoena from the Securities and Exchange Commission, demanding an immediate and comprehensive audit of his entire fraudulent investment portfolio. At 12:14 in the morning, a heavy pounding rattled my apartment door. The aggressive, frantic banging echoed through the quiet hallway of my modest building. I was not startled. Porch. I set my teacup down, checked the security feed on my phone, and smiled. It was DeAndre. His tailored designer suits and cam startup persona were completely gone. He was wearing a rumpled dark hoodie, his eyes wide and bloodshot, pacing the hallway like a trapped animal. As he raised his fist to pound again, I unlocked the deadbolt and pulled the door open. Porch. He pushed past me immediately, bringing the smell of sweat and pure panic into my small living room. He pointed a shaking finger at me, demanding I log into the server and restore their access because they were losing thousands of dollars every hour. I quietly closed the front door and locked it behind him. Porch. I told him to keep his voice down because my children were sleeping in the next room and the walls were thin. He yelled that he did not care about my kids, grabbing his head in absolute desperation. He panicked that his lead developer was threatening to quit, and the venture capital firm was demanding a technical audit at 8 in the morning because the system was completely down. Porch. He accused me of federal corporate sabotage and threatened to call the police. I walked over to my small kitchen island and opened my laptop, calmly pointing out they could not arrest someone for locking her own house. DeAndre stepped dangerously close, glaring down at me in the dim light. His manufactured charm had vanished, replaced by sheer hostility. Porch. He sneered that it was not my house, that the software belonged to his company, and claimed they had taken me in when I had nothing. He boasted that Bradley had given me a lifestyle I could never achieve on my own, threatening to ruin my career and bury me in lawsuits. Porch. I typed my decryption password into the terminal, the soft clicks of the keyboard being the only sound in the room for 10 seconds. I stated the facts clearly, keeping my voice level. I reminded him that he had used my basic algorithm to build a $10 million valuation, waiting to steal it while I was recovering from an emergency C-section. Porch. While I was hooked up to monitors fighting a severe infection, he was downloading my work onto a flash drive and selling it as his own invention. He argued that it was his intellectual property, registered under Ashield Tech with a federal trademark, claiming I had no legal right to it. I slowly repeated the name of his company, savoring the irony of his ignorance. Porch. I asked if he had ever bothered to check who actually owned the trademark for Ashield, or if he had just assumed that because I was a work-from-home mother, I had not protected my assets. I turned the laptop screen to face him. The screen displayed both the state registry and the federal trademark filings. Porch. The registered owner of Ashield Tech was not DeAndre, and it was not his venture capital firm. It was me, Gwendolyn. The registration date clearly showed the entity had been formed 5 years ago. I explained that I had established the company the moment I noticed irregularities in Bradley's financial accounts. Porch. He had not stolen a free algorithm. He had unlawfully commercialized an established company's software. Technically, his startup was just an unauthorized vendor, and revoking the license was simply me enforcing my terms of service. He had no product, no company, and was nothing but a fraud. Porch. DeAndre's face went completely pale as he stared at the screen, his chest heaving as the reality of his financial ruin set in. But his pride refused to let him back down. He slammed his hand on the island and leaned over, attempting to use his size to intimidate me. He demanded I sign the ownership over immediately, threatening that I would regret crossing him. Porch. He took an aggressive step forward, invading my personal space to try and make me back away. I did not move an inch. I stood my ground, looked him in the eyes, and pressed a single key on my laptop. A clear, undeniable recording filled the kitchen. Porch. It was Bradley's voice saying they needed to move $300,000 before Friday because the SEC was looking into his main accounts, and he needed to funnel the funds into DeAndre's startup as a clean vendor payment. Then DeAndre's relaxed, arrogant voice played, agreeing to fabricate a fake invoice for server maintenance and software development, and telling him to wire the cash through the offshore account just like last time. I hit the spacebar to pause the recording. The silence that followed was heavy. DeAndre stopped moving, his hands trembling against the counter. The aggressive energy completely evaporated, replaced by the paralyzing fear of federal prison. I told him calmly that I had monitored every device connected to the estate's network for 3 years. I had gigabytes of audio recordings, deleted wire transfers, and encrypted chat logs proving his $10 million startup was just a front for Bradley's money laundering. DeAndre tried to speak, but no words came out. His knees buckled under his own weight. He gripped the edge of the kitchen counter and slid down to the cheap linoleum floor, completely defeated, looking up at me with hollow eyes. The arrogant tech CEO was entirely gone. I looked down at the man who had mocked me hours earlier and asked if he still wanted to sue me for corporate sabotage, or if he wanted me to forward the audio file directly to the FBI. DeAndre scrambled up from the floor like a beaten dog and stumbled out of my apartment without saying another word. I locked the door, finished my tea, and slept better than I had in a decade. 12 hours later, the real architect of my past misery made his grand entrance. I was sitting in my actual office building in downtown Chicago, located in a high-security, restricted access zone with glass desks and panoramic windows overlooking the city skyline. A far cry from the cramped basement office my ex-husband's family assumed I worked in. As I was reviewing the encrypted logs of DeAndre's frozen servers, the heavy glass doors of our suite were practically thrown open. Bradley marched into the secure area, his face flushed a deep, angry red. Beside him was a tall, sharp-eyed corporate lawyer in a pinstripe suit, clutching a thick leather briefcase. Bradley had clearly used his high-priced attorney to bulldoze past the security downstairs, desperate to resolve the crisis from the night before. Bradley slammed his hands onto my desk, leaning over to intimidate me just like his brother-in-law had. He demanded the master code, shouting that DeAndre had suffered a complete breakdown. The entire platform was locked, and his funds were trapped in the system. He threatened that his lawyer would bury me in lawsuits if I did not unlock the servers immediately. The lawyer stepped forward, pulled a stack of legal documents from his briefcase, and slammed them onto my desk. You are in violation of intellectual property laws, Miss Thorne, the lawyer said smoothly, adjusting his expensive silk tie. You have unlawfully restricted access to the Ashield Tech servers. Restore access, or we will file for an emergency injunction and pursue criminal damages within the hour. I didn't even look at the documents. I leaned back in my ergonomic chair and picked up my pen. I am the sole registered owner of Ashield Tech, I replied calmly. DeAndre stole my proprietary architecture. I simply revoked the license of a vendor who violated my terms of service. You cannot sue me for locking the door to my own digital property. Bradley let out a harsh, dry laugh, running a hand through his perfectly styled hair. You think you're so smart, Gwen? You think playing these little hacking games gives you leverage? You're dreaming. I want that code. If you don't type it into your computer right now, I'm calling my family court judge. He pointed his finger directly in my face, the veins in his neck bulging. I will file for full, immediate custody of Leo and Mia today. I'll tell the judge your cramped little apartment is unfit for my children. Porch. I'll tell them you're mentally unstable, acting out of spite over the divorce. You're just a broke-it support tech who gets paid pennies to fix keyboards. The judge will take one look at my mansion, look at my bank accounts, and hand them over in a heartbeat. Give the code to DeAndre, or say goodbye to the twins forever. The threat hung heavy in the air of the sterile, air-conditioned office. Porch. Bradley smirked, completely convinced he had just played his winning card. He expected me to crumble, to cry, to beg for my children. Instead, the frosted glass door behind my desk slid open with a soft mechanical hiss. Director Vance stepped out of his office. He was a tall, imposing man with graying hair and the unmistakable, rigid posture of a lifelong military commander. Porch. He held an encrypted tablet under his arm and stared at Bradley with a gaze cold enough to freeze water. "Is there a problem out here, Gwendolyn?" Director Vance asked, his deep voice carrying absolute, unquestioned authority. I stood up and smoothed the front of my tailored blazer. "No problem at all, Director." I pointed to my ex-husband. "Porch. Bradley, I'd like you to meet Director Vance of the Department of Defense. I don't fix keyboards. I'm a senior cybersecurity consultant for the federal government. My salary is significantly higher than your artificially inflated wealth management income. You will never take my children." Bradley blinked, taking a slow step back. "Porch." The arrogant sneer vanished from his face, replaced by a sudden, jarring confusion. He looked at Director Vance, then out the panoramic windows, finally starting to process the reality that he had just barged into a high-tech, restricted government facility. "I don't care who your boss is," Bradley stammered, though his voice had completely lost its aggression. "Porch, you are legally obligated to release those servers. We have contracts, and our funds are trapped in that infrastructure." I ignored Bradley entirely and turned my attention to his sharp corporate lawyer. I reached into my drawer and pulled out a heavy leatherette folder, sliding it across the glass desk so it landed precisely in front of him. "Porch. I suggest you review your client's financial stability before you start charging him for any more billable hours," I advised, tapping the top of the folder. The lawyer frowned cautiously, picking up the file and flipping it open. "In our divorce agreement, Bradley demanded absolute sole ownership of his massive investment portfolio," I explained. My voice steady and clear in the quiet room. "Porch. He forced me to sign away all marital rights to that fund, fully convinced he was leaving me destitute. But by taking 100% of the portfolio in the divorce, he also took 100% of the legal liability." Bradley scoffed, crossing his arms. "My portfolio is bulletproof. You're bluffing." "Porch. I never bluff, Bradley." I kept my eyes on the lawyer, whose face was rapidly losing color as he scanned the first page of the file. 80% of your precious investment fund is an illegal Ponzi scheme. I've spent the last 3 years tracking your offshore wire transfers, your fake vendor invoices, and the shell companies you used to launder money disguised as tech startups. Porch. My signature on those divorce papers wasn't a surrender. It was the only thing legally isolating me from your federal crimes. The corporate lawyer stopped reading. He looked up, his eyes wide with absolute professional terror. He looked at the federal seal on the forensic accounting report, looked at Director Vance standing imposing at the door, and then slowly turned to Bradley. "Porch." The lawyer slammed the folder back onto my desk. He let go of his leather briefcase, letting it drop to the carpeted floor with a heavy thud. He took 3 large steps back, physically creating a massive distance between himself and Bradley. "I am officially withdrawing as your counsel," the lawyer declared, his voice trembling slightly. "Do not contact my firm again." Porch. On a cool Tuesday afternoon filled with the sound of children's laughter, I stood outside the heavy iron gates of Oak Ridge Elementary. Leo and Mia were 5 minutes away from being dismissed. I checked my phone, casually scrolling through the final confirmation email from Director Vance. Bradley's entire financial world had been officially frozen under federal investigation. Porch. I took a deep breath of the crisp autumn air, finally feeling a sense of true peace. That peace was instantly shattered by the screech of tires. A silver luxury SUV mounted the curb, parking crookedly across two reserved spots. The driver's door flew open, slamming into a nearby trash can with a loud metallic crash. Patricia stormed onto the sidewalk. She looked terrible. Her usually immaculate blonde hair was messy, blown wild by the wind. She wore a crumpled cashmere coat slung unevenly over her shoulders, and her designer sunglasses were crooked on her face. "Gwendolyn!" Patricia shrieked, her voice cutting through the quiet schoolyard. Dozens of wealthy parents nearby stopped their polite conversations and turned around, eyes wide. Patricia marched straight toward me, her heels clicking aggressively on the pavement. She pointed a manicured finger directly at my chest, her face distorted in a mask of absolute rage and desperation. "You venomous, ungrateful little snake!" she screamed, completely discarding her high society facade. "Do you have any idea what you've done?" My platinum card was declined at the country club this morning. The bank froze my primary checking account. Bradley is sitting in a lawyer's office on the verge of tears because federal agents are tearing his firm apart. You orchestrated this whole witch hunt just to ruin us. I stood perfectly still, hands slipped casually into my trench coat pockets. I didn't flinch, and I didn't raise my voice. I simply let her voice her pathetic grievances for all the suburban parents to hear. "Bradley ruined himself, Patricia," I replied, my voice carrying clearly over the murmurs of the crowd. "He built a fraudulent empire on stolen money. I just walked out of the blast radius before the bomb went off." Patricia gasped, pressing a hand to her chest as if I had physically struck her. She looked around at the gathering crowd of parents, instantly switching to her favorite role, the tragic, wronged victim. "Listen to her!" Patricia cried out to the onlookers. "Listen to how she talks to her family. We gave this girl everything. I welcomed her into my home. I allowed you to sit at my formal dining table when you were nothing but middle-class trash, Gwen. You had nothing before my son pulled you out of obscurity. We elevated your social standing, and you repay me by framing my innocent boy." The sheer delusion was staggering. For years, I had held my tongue to keep the peace. I had smiled politely while she insulted my clothes, my upbringing, and my career. But I was no longer the quiet, submissive wife she could verbally abuse without consequence. You never elevated me, Patricia. I took a firm step forward. The freezing cold in my voice made her instinctively step back. "You barely tolerated me because my income paid the mortgage on that mansion while Bradley was desperately faking his way to the top. Don't stand here and lecture me on kindness. I remember exactly how you treated my family. You fed my children expired food from the back of your pantry while you went out and bought yourself Prada handbags with money that didn't belong to you." Patricia's face turned a deep shade of purple. "How dare you accuse me of such vulgar things?" she sputtered, her hands shaking wildly. "I accuse you of living on borrowed time," I countered, raising my voice just enough to ensure the parents in the back heard every syllable. "You are completely broke because your son stole from his clients to fund your lifestyle. The designer shoes, the country club membership, the luxury cars. Every single piece of your fake reality was bought with dirty money. The game is over." The surrounding parents began to whisper frantically. A few discreetly pulled out their phones, clearly recording the explosive confrontation. Patricia noticed the shifting dynamic. She saw the wealthy elite looking at her not with sympathy, but with deep disgust and suspicion. Her massive ego could not handle the public humiliation. The mask shattered completely, leaving only pure, reckless arrogance. "You think you've won because you froze a few bank accounts?" Patricia shrieked, leaning in until I could smell the stale wine on her breath. "You're just a pathetic employee playing with fire in a circle where you don't belong. You think Bradley and I were stupid enough to leave everything in the banks? I have enough cash locked in my private safe at home to destroy you in court. I will bury you in lawsuits so deep you'll never see Leo and Mia again. You'll end up penniless and alone, Gwen." She stood panting, a triumphant smirk slowly creeping back onto her face as she waited for me to break. She firmly believed that throwing her hidden wealth in my face would finally put me in my place. I didn't break. I didn't panic. A slow, genuinely warm smile spread across my face. I looked past Patricia's shoulder, toward the street behind her. "That is incredibly useful information, Patricia," I said softly. I raised my right hand and gave a polite, cheerful wave toward a black SUV, with heavily tinted windows idling across from the main school gates. It had been sitting there quietly for 20 minutes. Patricia frowned, turning her head to follow my gaze. The heavy doors of the SUV opened. 2 men stepped onto the sidewalk. They wore dark, unbranded suits, and official federal badges were securely clipped to their belts. They walked in unison, with clear purpose, straight across the street and through the stunned crowd of parents. "Patricia, I'd like to introduce Special Agent Miller and Special Agent Davis," I said, pointing to the approaching men. "They are lead investigators with the Internal Revenue Service." Patricia froze completely. The smug smirk vanished, replaced by pure, suffocating terror. "They've been monitoring Bradley's immediate family all morning," I continued, my voice entirely devoid of sympathy. "And they just recorded your very loud, very public admission that you are harboring a massive amount of undeclared cash in a hidden personal safe. Enjoy your audit." The morning after Patricia's spectacular public meltdown, I decided to treat myself to an overpriced latte at the boutique bakery a block from my office building. I was standing at the condiment station, putting a lid on my coffee, when a heavy hand suddenly grabbed my elbow. I spun around, my free hand instinctively reaching into my pocket for my pepper spray, but stopped when I saw the face. It was DeAndre. If Patricia had looked like a manic mess yesterday, DeAndre looked like a walking corpse today. He was wearing the same dark hoodie from 2 nights ago. He smelled of stale coffee, cold sweat, and sheer panic. His eyes were bloodshot, darting around the crowded cafe as if he expected federal agents to drop from the ceiling vents at any moment. "Give me 5 minutes, Gwen. Please," he panted, his voice a hoarse, desperate whisper. "Just 5 minutes. You owe me." "I don't owe you anything, DeAndre," I replied, my voice completely level. I took a step back, forcing him to release my arm. "But I have 10 minutes before my morning briefing. Sit down." We walked to a small, secluded table in the back corner of the coffee shop. DeAndre collapsed into the chair, immediately leaning forward and burying his face in his hands. The arrogant tech founder was completely gone. "The venture capital firm executed the technical audit yesterday morning," DeAndre stammered, staring blindly at the scratched wood. "When my lead developer couldn't bypass your master lock, they pulled our funding. Every single dollar. They're filing investor fraud charges with the SEC by the end of the week because they realized I don't own the proprietary algorithm I sold them. That is the standard penalty for intellectual property theft," I said, taking a slow sip of my latte. "You stole an architecture protected by a federal trademark. You should be contacting a criminal defense lawyer, not your ex-sister-in-law." DeAndre looked up, his eyes glassy and wild. "It's not just the business, Gwen. It's Monica." He swallowed hard, his Adam's apple moving convulsively. "She's packing her bags. She found out the black cards were declined. When I told her the startup funds were frozen and Bradley was under federal investigation, she lost it. She told me she didn't marry a broke fraud. She's threatening to leave me, Gwen. My marriage is over because the money is gone." I set my coffee cup down with a sharp, decisive click. I leaned across the small table, closing the distance between us to make sure my words cut right through his pathetic plea for sympathy. "You want me to feel sorry for Monica?" I asked, my tone ice-cold and razor-sharp. "The same Monica who stood in my kitchen last Thanksgiving, drinking expensive wine I paid for, laughing at my clothes until she cried. You two stood there in your tailored suits, openly mocking my thrift store sweater. You called me a charity case. You told me I should be eternally grateful that a man of Bradley's status allowed middle-class trash to sit at his table. Orch. Do you remember that, DeAndre? DeAndre flinched, shrinking back into his chair. He opened his mouth to offer an apology, but the words died in his throat. He knew exactly what they had done. I don't care about your marriage, I continued mercilessly. And I don't care if Monica leaves you for a wealthier target. But I am a businesswoman, DeAndre. Orch, and right now, you are holding a depreciated asset that I highly value. DeAndre's head snapped up, a small, pathetic spark of hope ignited in his bloodshot eyes. What do you want? I'll do anything, Gwen. I swear. Just tell me. I'm going to offer you a lifeline. I folded my hands neatly on the table. Orch. I will grant your shell company a limited, non-exclusive, highly monitored software license for AshShield Tech. It will be legally binding and backdated. It will give you enough operational access to show your VC investors a working product. That will turn your federal wire fraud crisis into a simple corporate licensing dispute. Orch, you stay out of federal prison for defrauding investors, and you walk away with whatever crumbs of capital they allow you to keep. DeAndre stared at me, his mouth slightly open. He was practically shaking with relief. You'd do that? You'd give me the license? For a price, I interrupted, cutting his brief moment of joy short. And it is entirely non-negotiable. Orch. I pulled a single sheet of paper from my bag and slid it across the table. It was a blank legal affidavit. You are going to sign a sworn, legally binding federal affidavit, I commanded, keeping my eyes locked on his. Orch. You will detail every single illegal wire transfer, every fabricated vendor invoice, and every offshore account Bradley used to launder his stolen investment funds through your startup. You will testify that he orchestrated the entire scheme. You will hand his head to the authorities on a silver platter to guarantee his conviction. DeAndre stared at the blank paper as if it were a loaded gun. Orch. His breathing became shallow and rapid. Gwen, he's my brother-in-law. He's Monica's brother. If I sign this, I'm sending him to federal prison for decades. He'll be completely ruined. He is already ruined, I corrected him sharply. Now the only question is whether you let him drag you down with him. Bradley used you as a shield. Orch. He set it up so you would take the fall if the SEC audited his primary accounts. You owe him absolutely zero loyalty. Sign the paper, DeAndre. Save yourself. Save whatever is left of your pathetic marriage. A thick, suffocating silence stretched between us. DeAndre looked at the paper, then back at me. Orch. Whatever family loyalty he had left evaporated, entirely replaced by the raw instinct of self-preservation. He reached into his jacket pocket, pulled out a heavy silver pen, and clicked it. I'll sign, DeAndre whispered, his hand trembling as he brought the pen to the paper. I'll sign whatever you want. I'll give them everything they need to take Bradley down. Just give me the license. Orch. He began writing his full legal name at the top of the affidavit. Neither of us heard the clicking of designer heels approaching our table. Neither of us noticed the shadow falling over the wood until a heavy Prada handbag slammed onto the coffee shop floor with a deafening crash. DeAndre froze. He slowly turned his head, the color draining from his face. Orch. Monica was standing just 3 feet behind him. Her face was a mask of pure, unadulterated horror. She had heard every single word. She had been standing in the shadows, listening to her husband casually trade her beloved brother's freedom for his own. The loud thud of the Prada bag drew the attention of every customer and barista in the quiet cafe. Orch. Monica's perfect, carefully manicured posture went incredibly rigid. DeAndre remained paralyzed. The heavy silver pen slipped from his trembling fingers, clattering loudly against the table, and rolling over the newly signed affidavit. His bloodshot eyes were wide with panic as he met his wife's furious gaze. Orch. Monica, baby, please, DeAndre stammered, raising his hands in a pathetic gesture of surrender. You have to understand the position they put me in. They had me in a corner. Monica didn't even look at him. Her gaze shifted from her cowardly husband and locked onto me with pure, venomous hatred. The shock in her body instantly transformed into blind, reckless rage. Torch. Every ounce of her high society upbringing vanished in a second. She lunged forward, grabbing a cup of hot coffee DeAndre had just ordered from the edge of our table. With a guttural scream, she threw the hot liquid directly at my face. My reflexes kicked in instantly. I grabbed the heavy laminated menu from the center of the table and held it up like a shield. Torch. The dark coffee splashed violently against the thick plastic, dripping harmlessly onto the hardwood floor in a steaming puddle. "You are tearing my family apart!" Monica shrieked, her voice echoing off the brick walls of the cafe. Customers scrambled out of their chairs, grabbing their things and fleeing the unfolding disaster. Torch. The barista froze behind the counter, holding a steaming pitcher of milk in mid-air. Monica stepped closer, her chest heaving, pointing a trembling finger aggressively at my chest. "You never belonged with us," she yelled, her voice cracking with resentment. "You were always the ugly duckling sitting in the corner, secretly jealous of our money. You hated us from the start. Torch. You wanted the cars, the mansion, the status, and now you want to destroy us because you could never actually be one of us." I slowly lowered the coffee-stained menu, placing it flat on the table, making sure not to smudge the crucial affidavit. I stood up, smoothed the front of my tailored blazer, and drew myself up to my full height. I didn't yell. Torch. I didn't need to raise my voice to command the room. My voice was deadly, precise, cutting through her hysteria with absolute clarity. "Your money was an illusion, Monica," I stated, watching the defiance in her eyes begin to flicker. "You paraded around in designer clothes, bought with stolen, laundered funds. Torch. Your entire existence, the country club membership, the luxury vacations, your children's private school tuition, was funded by your brother's criminal enterprise. You aren't royalty. You are the beneficiary of a massive federal crime." Monica opened her mouth to argue, gasping for air. But I took a firm step forward, forcing her to back up. Torch. As for tearing your family apart, I suggest you take a look at the man cowering in the chair next to you, I continued mercilessly, pointing at DeAndre. Your husband just sold your brother to the FBI to save his own skin. The second his bank account was threatened, he signed away Bradley's freedom. Monica whipped her head toward DeAndre. Torch. He shrank into his seat, trying to make himself look as small as possible. He couldn't meet her gaze, looking completely defeated. "I had no choice, Monica," DeAndre pleaded, his voice hoarse with desperation. "The SEC is coming. The VC firm pulled our funds. If I didn't sign, I was going to prison for investor fraud. Bradley set me up to take the fall. He used my startup to dump his dirty money. Torch. I had to protect myself. I had to protect our marriage." Monica stared at him with pure, unadulterated disgust. The realization that her luxury lifestyle was built on fraud, coupled with her husband's instant, cowardly betrayal, pushed her into a panic. She dropped to her knees, frantically rummaging through her fallen Prada bag. Torch. Her hands shook so violently that she knocked over her makeup case, spilling expensive lipsticks and powder compacts across the floor. She finally grabbed her smartphone, clutched it, and struggled to stand back up. "I'm calling Bradley right now," Monica spat, her fingers tapping wildly on the glass screen. "I'm going to warn him about what this coward just did. Torch. He'll hire the best defense team in the country. He'll liquidate his offshore accounts, and he will make absolutely sure you end up with nothing, Gwen. You will pay for what you've done to us." She pressed the phone to her ear, listening anxiously for the ring. A desperate, triumphant smirk began to crawl back onto her face. Torch. She firmly believed she still had the power to defeat me, using her family's endless resources to push me down one last time. I simply smiled, a cold, detached expression. I glanced down at the sleek smartwatch on my wrist, noting the exact hour and minute. "I wouldn't bother, Monica," I said calmly, keeping my hands at my sides. "Federal agents breached his office 4 minutes ago." Torch. Monica scoffed, refusing to lower the phone. "You're bluffing. You're just a bitter employee making up lies." Right then, the volume on the television above the cafe counter suddenly surged. The barista, who had been watching the confrontation in shock, grabbed the remote and turned it up. I silently pointed to the large flat-screen TV hanging above the pastry display. Porch. Monica slowly turned her head. Her phone slid slightly from her ear as she stared at the screen. A bright red breaking news banner flashed across the bottom of the broadcast. Live helicopter footage showed the gleaming glass facade of Bradley's downtown corporate headquarters, surrounded by police cars with flashing red and blue lights. The camera zoomed in on the main entrance. Porch. The heavy revolving doors pushed open and Bradley emerged. His arrogant stride was completely gone. His expensive tailored suit jacket was rumpled, and his head was bowed in absolute crushing defeat. He was escorted out of his building with his hands secured behind his back in heavy steel handcuffs. Porch. He was flanked by serious-looking federal agents wearing dark windbreakers with FBI printed in bright yellow across the back. Monica's phone slipped from her trembling fingers, crashing onto the floor and shattering the screen into a web of cracks. Porch. She stood frozen in the center of the cafe, unable to tear her eyes away from the screen, watching her once untouchable brother get pushed into the back of a black government vehicle. 48 hours after his arrest was broadcast live, Bradley managed to get out of federal custody. Porch. He had to drain the last drop of cash from Patricia's legal retirement accounts to pay his staggering bail, leaving his mother with nothing but the clothes in her closet and an impending IRS audit. But Bradley didn't use this temporary, highly restricted freedom to prepare a quiet plea deal. Porch. True to his family's toxic nature, he turned aggressively to his only remaining strategy: playing the victim. The interrogation room inside the SEC federal field office was windowless, sterile, and freezing cold. I sat perfectly still in a hard metal chair, hands folded neatly in my lap. Directly across the scratched aluminum table sat my ex-husband. Porch. He had completely abandoned his tailored, arrogant aesthetic, wearing a rumpled beige button-down with messy hair and dark circles under his eyes. Sitting next to him was a sweating, overwhelmed court-appointed lawyer, the only legal counsel he could secure after his high-priced corporate attorney abandoned him. Porch. Agent Miller and lead investigator Reynolds stood near the heavy steel door, their expressions entirely neutral as Bradley put on the performance of his life. "You have to look at the power dynamic here, agents," Bradley pleaded, leaning forward and clasping his hands together in manufactured distress. "I'm just a wealth manager. I assess market risk and client portfolios. Porch. I don't know anything about cryptographic algorithms, server partitioning, or deep web architecture. But Gwendolyn does." He looked directly at the investigators, pointing a trembling finger in my direction. "She is a senior cybersecurity consultant for the Department of Defense," Bradley continued, his voice cracking with fake emotion. "She spent years setting up our home networks. Porch. When I started my firm, she insisted on designing the back-end security infrastructure to save us money. I trusted my wife with my entire digital life. But when our marriage started to break down, and when I realized she was mentally unstable and filed for divorce to protect our twins, she looked me in the eye and promised to burn my world to the ground." Porch. Bradley wiped away a non-existent tear from his cheek, leaning closer to the microphone in the center of the table. "She orchestrated the entire operation," he stated with chilling conviction. "She used her federal security clearance and her technical talent to manipulate the automated algorithms of my funds. Porch. She bypassed my security systems, siphoned the money, and transferred those stolen funds directly into DeAndre's startup servers to frame my entire family. I am completely innocent. I am the victim of a malicious, genius hacker who staged a massive financial crime just to get full custody of our kids and ruin my reputation." The silence in the interrogation room was heavy and suffocating. Porch. Bradley leaned back in his chair, panting, looking like a man who had just unburdened his soul. He shot a fleeting microsmirk in my direction. He truly believed his lie was bulletproof. He thought he could use my actual professional expertise against me, twisting my capability into a criminal weapon to save himself. Agent Reynolds slowly turned her gaze to me. Miss Thorne, these are very serious, highly specific allegations, she said, her voice betraying no emotion. Your ex-husband claims you actively manipulated his firm's digital infrastructure to orchestrate a multi-million-dollar money laundering conspiracy. How do you respond? I didn't raise my voice. I didn't rush to defend myself against his pathetic, desperate soap opera. I calmly unfolded my hands, reached into the inner pocket of my blazer, and pulled out a small, heavy titanium flash drive. I placed it deliberately in the exact center of the aluminum table. The sharp, metallic clink echoed off the bare concrete walls. I don't deal in domestic drama, Bradley. I deal in immutable data, I said, my eyes locking onto his pale face. I turned my attention to the two federal investigators. That drive contains a complete, unalterable blockchain audit trail of every transaction that flowed through Bradley's firm over the last 4 years. It doesn't just track IP addresses or server pings. It tracks hardware terminal IDs and the biometric logins required to execute each transfer. I leaned forward, mimicking Bradley's earlier posture but radiating absolute cold. The data on that drive proves irrefutably that Bradley personally initiated every single fraudulent wire transfer using his personal, encrypted laptop, I explained clearly. More importantly, the system required his personal biometric fingerprint on the trackpad to authorize any transfer over $10,000. I cannot forge his physical fingerprint, and I cannot spoof the proprietary hardware ID of a laptop that never left his side. Bradley scoffed, trying to maintain his fragile victim persona. You could have easily forged those logins, Gwen. You're a technical genius. You could plant that data to cover your tracks. I smiled. It was a cold, merciless expression that made the court-appointed lawyer sitting next to him flinch. I could, I agreed softly. But I didn't need to, because I didn't compile this data yesterday, Bradley. I turned my attention back to Agent Miller and Agent Reynolds. A full 6 months before our divorce papers were even filed, I reported the initial structural anomalies in Bradley's wealth management accounts to the SEC whistleblower hotline. I bypassed local authorities and went straight to the federal level because I knew his entire family was implicated. Bradley stopped breathing. The color drained from his face completely, leaving a sickly, translucent gray. For 3 years, I have been working as an active, confidential informant for the federal government, I stated, letting the absolute finality of my words crush the last bit of air from his lungs. I handed over decryption keys, wire transfer logs, and offshore routing numbers month by month. By the time I signed those divorce papers handing over your toxic portfolio, the trap was fully set. I don't need to defend myself against your ridiculous allegations today, Bradley, because I already have fully documented federal immunity. The realization hit Bradley like a freight train. His pathetic act shattered into 1,000 pieces. The reality of a multi-decade prison sentence rushed in, completely breaking his composure. A guttural, animalistic roar of pure rage tore from his throat. He lunged from his metal chair, kicking it backward against the concrete wall, and threw himself across the narrow aluminum table, reaching straight for my throat. I didn't even blink. Even before Bradley could propel himself across the table, the 2 federal guards stationed outside stormed the room like lightning. They intercepted him mid-air, slamming him face down onto the cold aluminum tabletop and instantly pinning his arms behind his back. The heavy, metallic thud of Bradley's face, hitting the metal, echoed through the interrogation room like a gunshot. I didn't flinch, and I didn't step back. I simply watched as the guards drove their knees into his spine, expertly locking the heavy steel cuffs around his wrists while he struggled and cursed. His wild, desperate rage was the final confirmation of his absolute defeat. Thank you for your time, agents. I said, my voice perfectly level. Porch. I grabbed my coat and walked out of the sterile, windowless room, leaving my ex-husband's desperate, animalistic screams locked behind the heavy steel door. The moment I stepped out of the federal building and into the crisp afternoon air, the digital guillotine dropped. Porch. The blockchain audit I provided triggered an automatic, instantaneous freeze on every single asset associated with the Thorn name. No loopholes, no hidden offshore accounts to drain. The entire fraudulent empire was wiped out in seconds. 3 days later, the financial storm reached the family stronghold. Porch. The sprawling, $1.5 million estate usually stood quiet and arrogant at the end of its private cul-de-sac. Today the manicured lawn was completely ruined. 3 massive, unmarked moving trucks parked on the grass, their heavy tires carving deep, muddy ruts into the expensive landscaping. The front doors of the mansion were wide open, revealing a scene of utter chaos inside. Porch. Patricia and Monica were systematically stripping the house like scavengers on a sinking ship. "Watch the frame, you idiot!" Patricia shrieked, her voice echoing through the grand foyer. She was wearing expensive lounge pants under a silk robe, her hair completely wild and unbrushed. Porch. She pointed a shaking, manicured finger at 2 sweating movers struggling to carry a massive gilded painting down the curved staircase. "That artwork has been in our family for 3 generations," Patricia yelled hysterically, waving them toward the door. "It belongs to us, not some bank. My husband bought that piece in Paris." Porch. "Get it to the truck before the auditors show up and try to steal what is mine." Her delusion was absolute. She genuinely believed she was the victim, completely ignoring that the money her late husband used to buy that painting had been funneled directly from Bradley's very first clients. To Patricia, the source of the wealth didn't matter. She only cared that she owned it. Porch. In the formal dining room, Monica was acting even more recklessly. She was aggressively sweeping antique sterling, silver flatware from velvet-lined drawers and dumping it into a heavy canvas duffel bag. Her hands shook violently. She looked completely unhinged, her eyes darting around the room as she muttered under her breath. Porch. Over the last 72 hours, she had been forced to face the reality of DeAndre turning state's witness against her brother, and her mind was snapping under the weight of impending poverty. "Hurry up, Mom!" Monica snapped aggressively, zipping up a bag packed with stolen silver. "The VC firm locked DeAndre out of everything. The accounts are wiped." Porch. "If the bank forecloses today, we have absolutely nothing. Go get the jewelry boxes from the master bedroom, and let's get out of here." They were so consumed by their frantic, greedy looting that they didn't hear the heavy hum of tires on the gravel driveway. They didn't notice the 3 black SUVs blockading the exit, trapping the unmarked moving vans. Porch. I stepped out of the lead vehicle, wearing a sharp charcoal suit and holding a heavy leather-bound clipboard. To my right stood a senior executive from the primary lending bank holding the mortgage. To my left were 2 uniformed city police officers, their hands resting casually on their utility belts. We walked up the wide brick path in lockstep, our footsteps loud and clear. Porch. Patricia walked out onto the grand front porch to yell at a mover, but the words died in her throat. She froze, her eyes stretching wide in shock as she took in the police vehicles blocking her escape. Then her gaze locked onto me. The shock instantly warped into blind, territorial rage. "Porch. Get off my property," Patricia screamed, her voice cracking as she stormed down the steps, pointing aggressively in my face. "You venomous, spiteful little snake. You have absolutely no right to be here. This is a private residence. You are trespassing. I'll have the police arrest you." Monica rushed out behind her mother, dropping a duffel bag onto the porch. Porch. The remaining color drained from her face when she saw the uniformed officers. "You destroyed my brother," Monica yelled, her voice trembling with hysteria. "You ruined my marriage. Isn't that enough, Gwen? What else do you want to take from us?" I stopped at the bottom of the porch steps. Porch. I looked up at the two women who had spent over a decade making me feel worthless, mocking my background, insulting my career, and treating me like disposable garbage. Now they stood in the ruins of their fraudulent kingdom, clutching stolen silver and screaming like cornered animals. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't need to. Arch. I simply held up the heavy clipboard and turned it around so Patricia could see the official bank foreclosure stamp on the top document. "I'm not trespassing, Patricia," I stated, my voice carrying clearly through the quiet, crisp air. "I've been hired by the bank as an independent digital auditor to track and recover all stolen assets linked to Bradley's accounts." Orch. Patricia's mouth fell open, her eyes darting frantically between my clipboard, the bank executive, and the police officers who were already walking over to secure the moving vans. "Put the painting down, Patricia," I commanded, my voice dropping to ice. "That belongs to the federal government now." The bank executive stepped forward, flanked by the officers. Orch. Without a word, he pointed a pen toward the open front door. The movers, realizing they were suddenly at the center of a federal asset seizure, immediately dropped the heavy gilded painting onto the mahogany porch. They held up their hands in surrender, leaving the priceless art leaning against a stone pillar, and practically sprinted back to their unmarked vans. Porch. Patricia stared at the abandoned painting, her mouth opening and closing in silent, frantic disbelief. Monica collapsed against the brick siding, burying her face in her hands and sobbing openly as the reality of her sudden poverty shattered whatever sanity she had left. I walked past them, my heels clicking sharply against the imported Italian tile of the grand entryway. Porch. The interior of the mansion was a chaotic graveyard of unearned luxury. Crystal vases were shoved carelessly into cardboard boxes, and Persian rugs were rolled up and tied with cheap twine. Patricia rushed in behind me, her silk slippers slapping frantically against the floor. Her initial shock was rapidly giving way to a calculated, desperate survival instinct. Porch. As a woman who had spent her entire life dodging accountability, her brain was frantically searching for a scapegoat to absorb the devastating blow. "If you're looking for stolen assets, you have the wrong family," Patricia declared, her voice suddenly adopting a sharp tone of authority. She pushed past me, speaking directly to the bank executive and the officers. "Bradley is an innocent man. Porch. He is the victim of corporate espionage." The lead officer raised an eyebrow, his hand resting casually on his belt. "Is that so, ma'am?" "Absolutely," Patricia insisted, her chest heaving as she adjusted her silk robe. She turned to glare at me, a malicious, triumphant gleam in her eyes. "You think you won, Gwendolyn? You think you can use your federal connections to ruin my son? Porch. But I know exactly who orchestrated the entire fraud scheme. It was DeAndre." Monica raised her tear-stained face, stumbling into the foyer. A look of fresh horror crossed her face as she watched her mother prepare to throw her husband to the wolves, without a single second thought. "Mom, what are you doing?" Monica choked out, gripping the banister. "Porch. I am saving this family, Monica," Patricia snapped, not even bothering to look at her daughter. She turned her attention fully back to the officers. "DeAndre used his tech startup to manipulate Bradley's accounts. He forced my son to launder that money, and I can prove it. Follow me." She gestured for the authorities to follow her down the grand hallway. Porch. I walked behind them, keeping the clipboard tucked neatly under my arm, my expression completely neutral. Patricia led us into Bradley's spacious, mahogany-paneled home office. The room smelled of expensive cigars and polished leather. Porch. She walked straight to a large, abstract painting hanging behind the heavy desk, ripping it off the wall to reveal a high-tech biometric keypad safe embedded deep in the reinforced drywall. "This will prove your little hacker friend DeAndre was the mastermind," Patricia sneered, looking back at me. Porch. She was so convinced of her own brilliance, so sure she had finally outsmarted me and fooled the federal government. "DeAndre brought a briefcase here 3 days ago. He demanded Bradley lock it up." He told Bradley it contained the stolen proprietary code and the algorithms used to manipulate the funds. He hid his digital evidence in my home to frame my son. Orch. The lead officer stepped forward, shining his heavy tactical flashlight on the keypad. "Open it, please." Patricia stepped up to the panel. She entered a complex 12-digit sequence, then pressed her thumb against the biometric scanner. With a heavy mechanical click, the steel door popped open and swung smoothly outward. "Orch." "Right there," Patricia declared, stepping back and gesturing grandly to the dark interior. "Take it all. Take the evidence. Arrest DeAndre and leave my innocent family alone." The officer reached inside. What he pulled out was not a sleek briefcase filled with technical documents, flash drives, or proprietary software patents. He pulled out a heavy, leather-bound financial ledger. Orch. He reached in again, pulling out 3 more identical ledgers, followed by a thick stack of watermarked, bound bank statements. Patricia's brow furrowed, her triumphant posture faltering slightly as the dust settled. "What is that? Those aren't briefcases." The bank executive stepped up beside the officer. "Orch." He took the top ledger, his experienced eyes scanning the gold lettering embossed on the cover. He flipped open the heavy book to the first page, his finger sliding down a column of printed data and routing numbers. "These aren't technical documents, ma'am," the executive stated, his voice devoid of sympathy. "Orch. These are highly detailed physical bank records from the Cayman Islands and the Bahamas." Patricia's face fell. The once arrogant, untouchable matriarch of the Thorne family suddenly looked incredibly small and fragile in the center of the massive office. I stepped forward, moving to the edge of the desk. I looked directly into Patricia's wide, terrified eyes. "Orch. The authorities didn't need DeAndre's proprietary code, Patricia," I explained, keeping my voice perfectly calm. "We already had the complete digital audit trail of Bradley's wire transfers. What the federal investigators were missing was the physical paper trail linking those offshore shell companies back to the primary account holders." Orch. The bank executive turned the heavy ledger around, holding it up so the harsh light of the officer's flashlight illuminated the very bottom of the page. "It's right here," the executive confirmed, tapping a line of text. At the bottom of the offshore registry, authorizing the transfer of millions of dollars in untaxed, laundered investment capital, was a large signature in deep blue ink. Orch. It wasn't DeAndre's signature. It wasn't even Bradley's. It was Patricia's distinct, unmistakable handwriting. Patricia stared blindly at her own signature. Her breath caught in her throat, a sharp gasp escaping her in the quiet room. She looked at the open, empty safe, then slowly turned her head back to look at me. The final, devastating realization hit her like a physical blow. Orch. DeAndre hadn't just sold Bradley out to save himself. When he sat across from me in that coffee shop, trembling in fear of federal prison, he had sold out the entire Thorne family. He gave me the exact location of Patricia's hidden physical ledgers, knowing they were the final nails in her coffin. Orch. "You knew," Patricia whispered, her voice stripped of its venom, replaced by absolute suffocating terror. "You knew exactly what was in there." I raised my clipboard, drawing a final decisive checkmark on my audit sheet. "I told you outside the school, Patricia," I replied, my tone carrying absolute finality. "I accused you of living on borrowed time. Well, your time is officially up." Orch. The lead officer sealed the heavy, leather-bound ledgers in a thick plastic evidence bag with a sharp pull of the zipper. I didn't stay to watch the remaining color drain from Patricia's face. I turned on my heel, walking through the empty, echoing foyer and out the grand double doors into the crisp afternoon air. The scene outside the mansion had dissolved into utter, uncontrolled madness. Orch. The long gravel driveway was blocked by 3 different federal vehicles and a heavy-duty flatbed tow truck. Officers were systematically impounding the unmarked moving vans Patricia had hired. Monica stood near Bradley's prized sports car, her hands in her hair, hyperventilating as an officer slapped a bright orange seizure sticker onto the windshield. Orch. DeAndre was standing a few yards away, clutching his car keys, his eyes darting toward the street, as if calculating his odds of escaping on foot. He had come to the house to secure his exit strategy, only to walk directly into the raid. Monica saw him. The sheer terror in her eyes solidified into a blinding, vicious rage. Arch. She marched across the gravel, her heels clicking aggressively on the stones. Without a word of warning, she raised her hand and slapped DeAndre hard across the face. The sharp, violent crack of the slap echoed across the estate. DeAndre stumbled back, dropping his car keys, his hand flying to his reddened cheek. "You spineless, pathetic coward!" Monica screamed, her voice cracking. "Arch. You sold my brother to the federal government. You sold out our entire family to save your worthless startup. We gave you everything, and the second the money ran out, you stabbed us in the back!" DeAndre lowered his hand, his own fear replaced by raw, defensive fury. He took a step toward her, pointing a shaking finger in her face. "Arch. Your family lied to me, Monica," DeAndre shouted back, his voice cracking under the strain. "Bradley used my company to dump his dirty money. He set me up to take the fall for his Ponzi scheme. The VC firm froze my accounts. The SEC is drafting an indictment. I am not going to federal prison for your fake empire. You are all broke." Arch. Before Monica could retaliate, the screech of tires interrupted their shouting. A gray sedan pulled up behind one of the police cruisers. The driver's door flew open, and Bradley scrambled out onto the pavement. He had just posted bail, using the last of Patricia's retirement funds to buy his temporary freedom. He looked completely wild. Arch. His suit was wrinkled, his tie was gone, and his eyes were filled with frantic desperation. He looked around, taking in the impounded vans, the tow truck backing up to his sports car, and his hysterical sister. Then his gaze snapped to the front porch. 2 officers were escorting Patricia out of the mansion. She looked small, defeated, and terrified. Arch. Following closely behind was the lead investigator, carrying the transparent evidence bag filled with the heavy offshore ledgers. Bradley stopped breathing. His brain processed exactly what those books were. "Are those the offshore records?" Bradley screamed, charging toward the porch. Before he could get close, a burly officer stepped directly into his path, forcing him to a halt. "Arch. Mom, tell me you didn't keep physical ledgers of the transfers. Tell me you didn't write them down." Patricia trembled, clutching her silk robe tightly around her waist. She couldn't meet her son's eyes. "I had to keep a record of the legacy, Bradley," she sobbed, her voice a pathetic whimper. "I had to ensure our family's wealth was protected and accounted for." Arch. "And you signed them?" Bradley roared, his face turning a dangerous purple. He struggled wildly against the officers, holding him back, spit flying from his lips. "You signed your name on the Cayman routing numbers? You stupid, arrogant woman! You just handed the SEC an open and shut conspiracy charge. You just guaranteed we all go down." Arch. I stood quietly on the manicured walkway. My hands slipped casually into my coat pockets. I watched the powerful Thorne family tear themselves apart. For 10 years, they had used their wealth like a blunt instrument. They had humiliated me at lavish dinners, mocked my practical clothes, and told me my genetics were unfit for their social circle. They believed their money made them untouchable. Arch. And now, stripped of their stolen millions, they were nothing but wild animals fighting over a carcass. They were destroying each other for the exact same money they used to torment me. The winch of the tow truck groaned as it pulled Bradley's luxury vehicle onto the metal flatbed. Monica collapsed onto the grass, sobbing uncontrollably. Arch. DeAndre was actively begging an officer to let him call his defense attorney. Patricia shrank under her son's verbal assault. Just then, a vehicle completely out of place in this chaotic crime scene slid smoothly onto the quiet suburban street. A midnight black stretch Lincoln Town car parted the sea of flashing police lights and tow trucks, coming to a silent halt directly in front of me. Arch. The rear passenger door opened. Marcus Vance, the highly celebrated CEO of Silicon Valley's largest cybersecurity conglomerate, stepped onto the pavement, He adjusted his tailored blazer, his sharp gaze briefly scanning the hysterical, unraveling Thorne family before ignoring them entirely. He walked straight toward me, extending his right hand with a bright, confident smile. "Porch." "Gwendolyn," Marcus announced, his deep voice effortlessly carrying over Bradley's screaming. "Apologies for disrupting your afternoon, but my legal team just finalized the paperwork, and I wanted to deliver the news in person." I took his hand, offering a firm, professional handshake. "Porch. The board just voted unanimously to approve the outright acquisition of your Ashield software architecture," Marcus stated clearly, turning his head slightly to ensure every single member of the ruined Thorne family could hear the exact figure. $25 million. The funds are currently clearing into your private account. Welcome to the executive team." I gripped Marcus Vance's hand. "Porch." The warmth of the Lincoln's interior beckoned to me, a sharp contrast to the cold reality of the collapsing Thorne family behind me. I didn't look back as Bradley yelled his mother's name, or as federal agents guided Patricia toward a police cruiser. "Porch." I stepped into the sleek sedan, the heavy door closing behind me, sealing away the last remnants of my old life and firmly establishing the beginning of my new one. Exactly 7 days later, the sky above the city cracked open, pouring down a freezing, relentless rain. I sat in the heated cabin of my new car, parked directly across from the heavy oak gates of the twins' private school. "Porch." The heater hummed softly. My phone rested on the center console, displaying a welcoming email from the Ashield board regarding my upcoming executive transition. Everything was finally secure. My assets were protected. My career was thriving. My children were safe, and then I saw him. "Porch." A miserable, drenched figure stumbled along the sidewalk, shivering in a cheap, waterlogged windbreaker that looked like it had been pulled from a donation bin. It was Bradley. He had lost his tailored suits, his arrogant smirk, and his perfectly styled hair. He looked hollowed out, a desperate ghost of the man who had spent 10 years treating me as an inferior. "Porch." His eyes were sunken with dark circles, his posture completely broken. By even stepping onto this street, he was in direct violation of a federal restraining order. I unlocked the car door, popped open my umbrella, and stepped out into the freezing rain. I intercepted him half a block away, keeping his chaotic presence far from the main gates where the other parents gathered. "Porch." He flinched when I blocked his path, his bloodshot eyes darting frantically across the wet pavement. "You are in violation of a court order, Bradley," I said, my voice cutting through the noise of the downpour. "If you don't turn around right now, I'm calling the police and your bail will be revoked." Right there on the wet concrete, he dropped straight to his knees. "Porch." The puddles instantly soaked through his thin pants. He pressed his hands together, looking up at me, tears mixing with the freezing rain pouring down his face. "Gwen, please," he gasped, his teeth literally chattering. "I just need 5 minutes. They took everything. My mom's accounts, Monica's trust, the offshore funds, all gone. The government took the house." "Porch." "My public defender says the SEC is pushing for 20 years. 20 years, Gwen, in federal prison. I won't survive it." "Actions have consequences," I replied coldly, feeling zero pity for the man groveling at my feet. "You built a fraudulent empire by stealing from innocent people, and now your house of cards has collapsed." "Porch." "We built a family together, Gwen," Bradley cried out, his voice cracking with desperation. He held his shaking fingers inches from my coat, too afraid of the restraining order to actually touch me. "You can't let your children's father go to prison. You have 25 million now. You're an executive. You have power, connections. You could hire the best defense team in the country. Porch. You could make this go away. I'll sign whatever you want. I'll give you full custody. Just don't let them take my life. Think of Leo. Think of Mia. They need their father." He was attempting to play his final, most manipulative card, weaponizing my love for my children to save himself. Porch. He thought he could exploit my maternal instincts the same way he had exploited my technical skills and patience for the last 10 years. Before I could tell him exactly what I thought of his performance, the heavy oak doors of the school opened. The afternoon dismissal bell echoed through the rain. Porch. Children began spilling out onto the covered porch, their bright raincoats cutting through the gray gloom. Amid the crowd, I saw Leo and Mia walking side by side, their backpacks slung over their shoulders. Bradley saw them too. He scrambled to his feet, ignoring me entirely, forcing a wild, fake smile onto his face. Porch. He wiped the rain and tears from his eyes, trying to project the image of a loving father. He took a step toward the porch, raising his hand high. "Leo! Mia! Daddy's here!" Bradley called out, his voice carrying a strained, sickening sweetness. "We're going to get ice cream!" The twins stopped at the edge of the stone steps. They looked at the drenched, desperate man standing in the rain. Porch. They didn't run to him. They didn't smile. Mia shrank back, her small hand gripping her backpack strap, her large eyes filled with apprehension. Bradley took another step forward, reaching his hand out. "Come give Daddy a hug. We're going to fix everything. I promise." Leo moved. He didn't walk toward his father. Porch. He shifted to the side, placing his body directly in front of his sister, blocking Bradley's view of her. My son stood tall, his expression a chilling copy of my own determination. He had endured enough of his father's toxic behavior to recognize the lie instantly. "You told Grandma we were just dead weight, Dad," Leo stated. Porch. His young voice was incredibly calm, carrying through the rain with devastating clarity. "You said we were expensive liabilities dragging you down. We heard you." Bradley froze. His outstretched hand fell limply to his side. The fake smile slipped from his face, replaced by absolute soul-crushing dread. His mouth opened, but no sound came out. Porch. He realized in that long second that his lies hadn't just destroyed his marriage and his freedom. He had completely and irrevocably lost the respect of his children. To them, he was nothing more than a stranger standing in the rain. I walked past Bradley, ignoring his existence entirely. Porch. I stepped onto the porch, placing protective hands on the shoulders of my children, guiding them under my umbrella. Together, we walked toward my waiting car. I opened the doors, made sure they were safely buckled in, and slid into the driver's seat. Porch. I shifted into drive and pulled away from the curb, leaving the architect of my past misery standing alone in the downpour as his world dissolved into nothingness. The fallout from Bradley's arrest and the seizure of the Thorne estate could not be confined to country club whispers or sealed federal indictments. Porch. Within 7 days, the sheer scale of the financial fraud turned my ex-husband's downfall into a media circus. The press smelled blood in the water, and the Thorne family was completely unequipped to handle the spotlight. I sat behind the wide glass desk of my new corner office at Ashield headquarters, sipping black coffee and watching the high-definition monitor mounted on the wall. Porch. Outside, the Silicon Valley skyline displayed the brilliance of legitimate success. On the screen, my former sister-in-law decided to go on the offensive. Monica was sitting on the plush beige sofa of a popular daytime talk show. She had completely discarded her usual luxury wardrobe in favor of a modest, pastel-colored cardigan. Her usually flawless hair was styled to look slightly unkempt. Porch. She was playing the role of the traumatized, oblivious victim, and she was putting every ounce of energy into the performance. The host, Sarah, leaned forward with a look of practiced sympathy. "I just had no idea of the scale of it," Monica choked out, dabbing at her dry eyes with a tissue. Bradley and Gwendolyn always had an incredibly toxic, combative dynamic behind closed doors. Porch. Gwen was always demanding more money, more status, more control. She pushed my brother to the absolute edge to maintain her lifestyle. My mother and I were just collateral damage in their twisted psychological warfare. I watched, fascinated, as she lied to the camera. She was using my supposed greed to mask her own complicity. Porch. She desperately wanted the public to see me as the spiteful, gold-digging ex-wife and herself as an innocent bystander caught in a financial disaster she had no part in. Sarah tilted her head slightly, keeping her professional composure. But the federal government seized your personal assets as well, Monica. Your trusts, your vehicles, your bank accounts. George, the authorities clearly believe you benefited from these crimes. Monica let out a loud, tragic sob, clutching the tissue to her chest. I have nothing left because of Gwen's vengeful crusade to destroy my brother, she stated, letting her voice tremble with manufactured despair. Yesterday, I had to walk into a local diner and ask the manager for a minimum wage job application. George, I've never worked in food service in my life. I'm a mother. I have absolutely no idea how I'm going to feed my children. All because my sister-in-law decided to punish our entire family for her failed marriage. She looked directly into the camera lens, aiming for maximum emotional impact. I just want my life back. I want to be left alone. George. Sarah nodded, slowly, looking appropriately solemn for her daytime audience. This is undeniably a devastating situation for you and your mother, Monica. The public backlash has been... Suddenly, Sarah stopped mid-sentence. She pressed 2 fingers tightly against her earpiece, her expression shifting from sympathy to razor-sharp focus in a fraction of a second. George. The control room was clearly feeding breaking news directly into her ear. Monica, please hold on for just a moment, Sarah said. Her voice instantly lost its warm, comforting tone, adopting a cold, journalistic edge. We are just receiving breaking news directly from the federal court regarding this exact case. Monica froze. The balled-up tissue remained suspended inches from her face. George. The calculated, tragic vulnerability in her eyes was instantly erased, replaced by genuine panic. She looked at the host, her body going rigid, as the reality of live television suddenly felt like a trap. Your estranged husband, DeAndre, has just officially entered a guilty plea with the FBI. Sarah read as a red breaking news banner flashed across the bottom of the screen. George. According to newly unsealed court documents, DeAndre has handed over a massive archive of encrypted corporate communications to federal prosecutors. Monica stopped breathing. The modest pastel cardigan suddenly looked suffocating. George. These documents contain thousands of direct messages and emails between you and your brother Bradley, Sarah continued, her eyes locking onto her guest with absolute ruthlessness. Furthermore, the FBI spokesperson has confirmed that these communications explicitly contradict the statements you have just made on this broadcast. George. I leaned back in my leather executive chair, resting my chin on my hands. I didn't even blink. The files, in your own words, outline exactly how you directed Bradley to structure the offshore accounts to hide the fraudulent funds, Sarah stated, her voice echoing in the quiet studio. George. The federal prosecutor stated, these emails prove you knowingly and actively spent millions in stolen investor capital to fund your personal lifestyle, with full knowledge that the money was illicit. The camera zoomed in tight on Monica's face. Every last drop of color drained from her face, leaving her looking like a terrified ghost. George. Her mouth opened and closed, but not a single sound came out. She looked wildly around the studio, staring at the cameras, the lighting rigs, and the host. She realized there was absolutely nowhere left to run. She had willingly walked into a live television studio to lie to millions of viewers, only for the federal trap to slam shut the moment the red on-air light flickered to life. George. Monica buried her face in her hands, her shoulders shaking violently, as she broke down into uncontrollable hysterics right there on that beige sofa in front of the entire country. The heavy oak doors of the federal courtroom shut tight, locking out the media circus on the courthouse steps. Inside, the room was freezing and sterile. I sat perfectly still in the polished oak witness box. George. I was wearing a sharp slate gray suit, which was a far cry from the plain, conservative clothes the Thorne family had relentlessly mocked for the last 10 years. Folding my hands neatly in my lap, I could feel the heavy, expectant gaze of the 12 jurors locked onto me. Across the room, Bradley sat at the defense table. He looked pathetic. George. The once untouchable heir to the Thorne empire had shrunk into a pale, sweating shell of his former self. His tailored suit hung loosely on his diminished frame. Standing beside him was Arthur Sterling, a powerful defense attorney famous for his ruthless, theatrical, and precise dismantling of witnesses. Porch. Sterling was pacing the floor, adjusting his expensive tie, getting ready to put on a show for the gallery. Stopping his pace, Sterling turned sharply to face me. He leaned against the wooden railing of the witness box, invading my personal space. "Let's talk about your impressive new venture, Gwendolyn," Sterling began, his voice dripping with practiced condescension. "Porch. You were recently appointed to the executive board of Aegis, one of the most powerful cybersecurity firms in Silicon Valley. You are a digital architect, a brilliant software engineer, and a woman who understands the complex, hidden networks of the internet better than anyone else in this room, correct?" "I am highly qualified in my field." "Yes," I replied, my voice steady and devoid of emotion. "Porch. Highly qualified is an understatement," Sterling scoffed, turning his back on me to address the jury directly. "You are a mastermind. Yet, for the past 10 years, you played the part of a simple, supportive housewife. But we know what was really going on behind the closed doors of the Thorne estate, don't we?" Porch. Sterling strode back to the defense table, grabbed a thick stack of printed logs, and slammed them onto the railing just inches from my hands. "While my client, Bradley Thorne, worked tirelessly to build a legitimate, thriving investment firm, you locked yourself away in your basement office," Sterling said, his voice rising with manufactured outrage. "You worked 80 hours a week. Porch. You barely slept. You completely neglected your marriage, and you ignored your own children, Leo and Mia, pushing them aside just to stare at lines of code in the dark." Bradley slumped even lower in his chair, trying to look like a heartbroken father. The jury watched me closely, waiting for a crack in my calm facade. I didn't give them the satisfaction. "Porch. You weren't just coding as a hobby, Gwendolyn," Sterling shouted, pointing an accusing finger directly at my face. "You were building a criminal empire. You used your high-level hacking skills to siphon millions of dollars from honest investors. You set up routing numbers in the Cayman Islands. You created a web of shell companies. Porch. And then, when the feds started closing in, you orchestrated everything to frame your technologically clueless husband. You engineered this entire financial disaster just to steal his wealth and ruin his life." A dead silence fell over the courtroom. The gallery held its collective breath. The prosecution objected to the badgering, but I raised my hand slightly, quietening my lawyer. "Porch." I looked Arthur Sterling dead in the eye. He was expecting a hysterical, defensive woman. He expected to see the timid victim the Thorne family had spent years trying to break. Instead, I smiled. It was a cold, sharp look that made Sterling visibly falter, taking a half step back. "Mr. Porch. Sterling, your understanding of cybersecurity is just as fraudulent as your client's investment portfolio," I said clearly, my voice carrying to the furthest corners of the room. "I didn't hack into anything. I simply knew how to read the digital footprint your client was too arrogant to cover up." Porch. Turning to the judge, I said, "Your Honor, with the court's permission, I would like to direct the jury's attention to Prosecution Exhibit 402. The judge nodded. A massive screen lowered behind the witness box, illuminating the dim courtroom with bright light. Rows of complex timestamps and long strings of digital code appeared on the display. Porch. Sterling rushed back to the defense table, pale and whispering frantically to Bradley. Bradley was shaking his head in denial, his panic breaking through his pitiful act. Porch. What you see on this screen are the exact IP and MAC addresses associated with every single wire transfer to the Cayman Islands, I explained, addressing the jury directly with the calm, authoritative tone of an executive running a boardroom. Every time money was taken from investors, a digital fingerprint was left behind. Mr. Porch. Sterling claims I was sitting in a basement orchestrating these crimes, but the data tells a very different story. I picked up a laser pointer from the stand and aimed a bright red dot at the first highlighted line of data. This specific IP address initiated 22 separate fraudulent transfers over a 6-month period, I stated. This IP address is registered to the private, high-speed Wi-Fi network at the Oak Ridge Country Club, specifically the men-only VIP cigar lounge. A room I was never allowed to enter, but where Bradley Thorne spent every single Thursday night. I moved the laser pointer down to the next highlighted section. This second set of IP addresses authorized the creation of the shell companies used to hide the funds. I continued, my voice cutting through the silent room like glass. These transfers were executed using the secure private network at the St. Regis Resort in Aspen. The exact dates of these transfers align perfectly with Bradley's week-long ski trip in February. A trip he claimed was business, but as previous testimony proved, was actually a romantic getaway with his mistress. A collective gasp rippled through the gallery. Bradley buried his head in his hands, clawing at his hair in absolute terror. Sterling stood completely frozen, his mouth half open. I moved the laser to the final, most damning string of data at the bottom of the screen. Finally, we have the hardware identifier, the MAC address, that physically triggered the final, desperate transfer of $15 million just days before the FBI raid. I looked away from the screen and stared directly at Bradley. As he slowly raised his head, our eyes locked. This MAC address belongs to a custom, platinum-plated smartphone. A phone purchased in Bradley Thorne's name, registered to his personal cell account, and recovered from his jacket pocket by federal agents during his arrest. I turned back to Arthur Sterling. The high-priced defense attorney was sweating profusely, his dramatic bluster completely shattered by the undeniable hardware-encoded evidence. Sir, the IP address is used to funnel this money match Bradley's favorite golf club, the luxury resort he took his mistress to, and his personal cell phone, I said, my voice echoing with absolute finality. Unless you are suggesting that I somehow followed him to a private hotel room with another woman, just to steal his Wi-Fi? The courtroom erupted into a chaotic symphony of shocked whispers, angry murmurs, and stifled laughter. The judge pounded his gavel repeatedly, calling for order, but the noise only grew. Sterling slumped into his chair, completely defeated. Bradley just stared at me, his eyes wide with the chilling realization that his own arrogance had built his prison, and I had just locked the door. The next morning, the heavy doors opened to a different kind of tension. Bradley Thorne sat at the defense table, his face a pale, defeated gray. Arthur Sterling had abandoned his theatrical pacing, choosing instead to scribble frantically on a legal pad, doing everything he could to avoid eye contact with the jury. The prosecution called their star cooperating witness. DeAndre walked down the center aisle. He wore a simple, off-the-rack gray suit, stripped of the flashy watches and custom cufflinks he used to show off at Thorne family dinners. His shoulders slumped under the heavy weight of his upcoming testimony. In the second row of the gallery, Monica sat rigid. She wore large, dark sunglasses indoors, clearly trying to hide her swollen eyes from the aggressive media capturing her every move. Yet, even behind the dark lenses, her posture radiated pure venom. As DeAndre raised his right hand to swear to tell the truth, Monica glared at him with a toxic, unblinking intensity. The lead prosecutor stepped up to the podium. Wasting no time on pleasantries, she immediately asked DeAndre to outline the exact infrastructure of Bradley's financial operation. Leaning into the microphone, DeAndre's voice trembled at first, but it steadied as he began reciting the undeniable facts. He explained how Bradley had approached him 8 months ago with a proposition. Bradley needed a legitimate-looking tech startup to act as a sponge to absorb massive amounts of illicit funds. DeAndre, desperate for venture capital and eager to impress his wealthy brother-in-law, agreed to be the CEO on paper. I set up the server infrastructure, DeAndre confessed, his voice echoing in the silent room. Bradley funneled the stolen investor capital through a series of shell companies in the Cayman Islands. Then, I fabricated invoices for cybersecurity consulting services that never actually happened. We cleaned $15 million in 6 months, making it look like legitimate business revenue. The jury took notes rapidly. Bradley kept his eyes glued to the defense table, his hands trembling. The prosecutor paced in front of the jury box, holding up a clear evidence bag containing a sleek silver hard drive. And the proprietary software your company claimed to be selling? The actual code you used to legitimize these massive invoices? Where did that come from? DeAndre swallowed hard. For the first time since taking the stand, he turned his head and looked directly at me. I sat in the very first row directly behind the prosecution table, posture perfect, and expression completely neutral. I stole it, DeAndre admitted. The silence in the room deepened, heavy and absolute. I stole the foundational architecture of the Aegis software directly from Gwendolyn's personal home server. A wave of shocked whispers swept through the gallery. The judge tapped his gavel once for order. The prosecutor prompted DeAndre to continue. "Why did you steal from your own sister-in-law?" she asked sharply. DeAndre gripped the edge of the witness stand. "Because Bradley told me to. He said Gwendolyn was too weak, too passive, and too busy playing the perfect housewife to ever realize what she actually had. Bradley convinced me that her code was just a hobby, a sad little side project that would just sit on a hard drive. He said she lacked the instinct to commercialize it, so we might as well take it and build our own empire. During a Sunday family dinner at their estate, I copied her directories. I took her life's work to save my failing company. I met his gaze. I didn't glare or show anger. I simply let him look at the woman he had so deeply underestimated, a woman who now sat on the executive board of a $25 million cybersecurity conglomerate. DeAndre was the first to look away in shame. The prosecution concluded its direct examination. Sterling's cross-examination was incredibly weak. He couldn't shake a witness who had already handed over encrypted hard drives and IP logs to the FBI and signed a plea agreement. As DeAndre stepped down, the court moved quickly to his sentencing under the plea deal. The judge, a stern, no-nonsense older man, stared over his glasses at the disgraced tech executive standing before him. "You have cooperated fully with federal authorities," the judge stated, his deep voice echoing through the courtroom speakers. "You provided the exact digital keys needed to dismantle this fraudulent network and secure a conviction against the mastermind. Because of this cooperation, and only because of it, I accept the prosecution's recommendation. You will not serve time in federal prison." A collective gasp went up from the Thorne family supporters in the gallery. Monica practically vibrated with rage. DeAndre let out a long, shaky breath, his knees nearly buckling with relief.